The summer heat settled over Millhaven like a wool blanket thrown over something already warm, thick and suffocating and impossible to shake loose. Clara Beaumont had lived through 23 of these summers and still hadn't made peace with any of them. She stood at the kitchen window of her family's farmhouse, watching the dry fields ripple in the distance like something alive, something restless, and she thought about how little had changed in this town since she was a girl, pressing her nose against this same glass, dreaming about somewhere else. Her father's farm had seen better days. Most things in Millhaven had. The fences needed mending along the eastern pasture. The barn roof had been patched so many times it looked like a quilt sewn by someone who kept running out of fabric, and the horses, what remained of them anyway, moved slowly through the heat like they, too, had given up on urgency. Clara's mother had passed 3 winters ago, and her father, Thomas Beaumont, had not been the same man since. He still woke before dawn. He still put his boots on one at a time. He still drank his coffee, black and bitter, the way he always had. But something behind his eyes had gone quiet in a way that couldn't be undone, and Clara had stayed on the farm because of it, because leaving felt like abandonment, because some daughters carry their love like a stone around their neck and mistake the weight for purpose. She had been accepted to a graduate program in literature at a university 3 states away. She had deferred twice. She was thinking about deferring again. The hired hand situation had become desperate by late June. Old Pete Harlan, who had worked the Beaumont land for 11 years, had thrown out his back lifting a fence post in a way that the doctor said required months of rest and probably a change of profession. Her father had posted a notice in town, something he hated doing, something that cost him a pride he couldn't afford to spend, and for 2 weeks no one came. Then on a Tuesday morning, when the thermometer outside the barn already read 91 degrees at 7 o'clock, a truck came up the gravel drive, trailing a cloud of red dust like something out of an old story about wanderers and wide-open land. His name was Cade. He was not what Clara expected, though she hadn't let herself expect much. He was tall in the way that seemed functional rather than decorative, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had never not been working. He wore a hat that had been through weather she couldn't name, and when he took it off to speak to her father, there was a pale line across his forehead where the sun hadn't reached. He had dark hair and darker eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed to be thinking about more than they let on, and a jaw set with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had learned not to say things he couldn't back up. Her father liked him immediately. Clara watched from the porch as they walked the perimeter of the eastern pasture together, her father gesturing and explaining with more animation than she had seen from him in months, and Cade listening with his hands in his back pockets and nodding in that slow, certain way that some people have, the way that makes you feel heard even from a distance. He had references. He had experience. He had nowhere else to be, which her father didn't ask about, but which Clara noticed because she was the kind of person who noticed the shape of what people didn't say. He moved into the small room above the tack house that had always been the hired hand's quarters, and by the next morning he was already at work before her father had finished his first cup of coffee. Clara tried to stay out of his way. This was not because she disliked him. It was because she was very aware of the way her eyes found him in the early mornings when he was leading the horses to water, aware of the way she listened for the sound of his footsteps crossing the yard, aware of the particular quality of silence that existed when he was nearby, a silence that felt fuller than it should have. She was not a girl who indulged these things. She was practical. She was the girl who had stayed, who had deferred her life for love of her father, who read 3 books a week and cooked dinner every night and knew exactly where her responsibilities began and ended. She was also very lonely, in the way that people who are surrounded by familiar things can still be profoundly lonely. A loneliness that comes not from the absence of others, but from the absence of being truly known. They began talking in the evenings almost by accident. She would bring a glass of lemonade out to the porch because the kitchen held the day's heat long after sunset, and he would be sitting on the steps of the tack house cleaning tack or reading, yet reading, which surprised her more than she expected, though she wasn't sure why she had assumed he wouldn't. He read history mostly, she learned, the Civil War, the settlement of the West. Real things, he said, things that happened to real people, because fiction required a kind of patience with uncertainty that he hadn't yet developed. She told him she would change his mind about fiction. He smiled at that, the first real smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, loosened something in it, made him look younger and less guarded. He said she was welcome to try. She lent him a novel she loved, a story about a woman crossing the plains in the 1870s, which she said was based on real diaries, which was a slight embellishment on her part, though not entirely untrue. He read it in 3 days and returned it to her with a folded piece of paper, inside marking a page near the end where a particular passage had stopped him. She read the passage again, something about how love is the only frontier that never closes, and she understood that he had not folded the page by accident. But they were careful. They were two careful people who had both learned, in their separate and different ways, that wanting something too quickly was how you lost it. She learned pieces of him the way you learn a landscape, not all at once, but gradually, through repeated exposure at different times of day, in different kinds of light. He had grown up in New Mexico on a ranch that his family had lost when he was 19, lost to debt and bad luck, and the particular cruelty of circumstance that doesn't ask permission before it takes things. He had worked other people's land since then, drifting in the way that some people drift, not aimlessly but with the specific purposefulness of someone who hasn't yet found the thing worth stopping for. He had a sister in Albuquerque he called on Sunday evenings, walking to the far end of the property for privacy, though Clara could sometimes hear the low rumble of his voice if the wind was right. He had loved someone once, he said one evening, and then stopped, and she didn't push, because she understood that some sentences don't need their endings spoken aloud. She told him about the graduate program. She told him about deferring, and about her father, and about the farm and the way it had begun to feel like a place she was haunting rather than inhabiting, like a woman who had become a ghost in her own life without quite noticing the transition. He listened in the way he always listened, without interrupting, without offering solutions she hadn't asked for. And when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that sounded like a hard kind of love to carry. She said yes, it was. July came in hotter than June had promised. The horses were sluggish, and the fields needed more water than the sky was providing, and Ellie worked from before sunup to after sundown without complaint, without slowing, with a steadiness that Clara's father remarked upon more than once, that kind of remark that older men make about younger men when they see in them something they recognize and approve of. Clara watched her father watching Ellie and thought about what it meant, that her father, who had not smiled easily since her mother died, smiled easily around this man. One afternoon in mid-July she was in the barn repairing a bridle that had come apart at the cheek-piece, sitting on an overturned feed bucket with leather and tools spread around her. When she heard him come in, she didn't look up. She had learned to track him without looking, had developed a spatial awareness of him that embarrassed her when she examined it too closely. He crouched beside her without being asked, and held the pieces she needed held while she worked. They didn't speak for a while. The barn was dim and smelled of hay and horse and old wood, and something warm that she always thought of as the particular smell of old honest labor, and the silence between them was the good kind. The kind that means two people have stopped performing for each other. He said, eventually, that she was good with her hands. She said she'd had to learn to be. He said he thought that was true of most of the best things about a person, that the things we had to learn said more about us than the things we were simply given. She looked up then and found him closer than she'd calculated, his face level with hers because of the angle of his crouch and her seated position, and she saw something in his expression that she recognized because she had been trying not to see it for weeks, had been looking away from it the way you look away from the sun, not because it is ugly, but because it is too much, because looking directly at it risks something. She said his name, just that, just Illy. And then a door that she had not opened happened to her, which is the only honest way to describe what Marcus Hale did to her 3 days later. Marcus Hale was not a bad man in the way that obvious villains are bad men. He was the bad man of a subtler variety, the kind who mistakes confidence for permission, who has been told yes so many times by the world that he has stopped genuinely registering the possibility of no. He was from one of the old Millhaven families, the kind whose name was on the bank and the hardware store and the memorial bench outside the courthouse, and he had coasted on that name for 31 years with the ease of someone coasting downhill, all speed and no effort and no real awareness of the grade. He had been pursuing Clara in a loose, intermittent way for 2 summers, the way some men pursue women they want without urgency, confident in the eventual outcome. She had discouraged him without drama because she did not want drama, had been pleasant and unavailable and clear in every way that did not require a direct confrontation, which she had hoped would be enough. It was not enough. He came to the farm on a Saturday afternoon under the pretense of speaking to her father about some local agricultural meeting, a pretense so thin it was essentially transparent, and her father was not there, having gone into town, and Illy was out on the far pasture, and Clara was alone in the yard near the garden pulling weeds in the dry and stubborn earth. She stood when she heard his truck. She dusted her hands on her jeans. She was polite because she was always polite. She told him her father wasn't home. He said that was fine. He said he'd come to see her anyway, which was not the surprise it might once have been. He was standing too close. She was aware of it and he moved with her, which was a dance she had not agreed to participate in, and she said clearly, she said Marcus, and he said something about how she was always so serious, always so careful, like carefulness was a flaw she needed to have corrected. And then he kissed her. It happened fast. It was not violent, but it was not gentle either. It was the kiss of someone who had decided something without consulting the other party, and it lasted only a moment before she stepped back sharply and put distance between them. Her heart was hitting hard. Her face was hot with something that was not embarrassment, but was related to it, the heat of violation, of having had a choice removed. She told him to leave. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. He tried to laugh it off. He said something about how she'd feel differently. He left when she didn't respond, when she simply stood in the yard and waited with a stillness that communicated something he couldn't argue with, the stillness of a woman who was done with conversation entirely. She stood there for a while after his truck disappeared down the drive. The garden looked different somehow. The afternoon looked different. She felt the particular, horrible smallness of having had something taken, something small in the objective record of the world's wrongs, but enormous in the private record of herself, her first kiss, which she had been in no hurry to give, but which she had imagined, in the vague and unlabored way of someone who still believes in the rightness of things, would belong to a moment she chose. She hadn't chosen it. It had been taken. She heard Illy before she saw him, the sound of his boots on the dry ground coming around the side of the barn, and she turned and her face must have told him something because he stopped walking. Immediately. He stopped and looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Something that moved from neutral to alert in the way it moves in people who pay attention, who watch the world closely enough to notice when something in it has gone wrong. He asked her what happened. Not who, not what's wrong, but what happened, which was the right question, direct and respectful of her competence at the same time. She told him. She told him all of it, plainly, the way she told him most things, without drama or decoration, just the facts of the thing, the facts of Marcus Hale's unasked, for mouth on hers, and the way it had felt like something being subtracted. Her voice stayed even. She was proud of herself for that, and also exhausted by the effort of it. Illy was very still while she spoke. That particular stillness of his, which she had come to understand, was not passivity, but the opposite of it. The stillness of someone holding something tightly contained. When she finished, he looked past her for a moment toward the road where the dust of Marcus Hale's truck had long since settled, and then he looked back at her. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean it completely, without the reflexive quality of apology as social reflex, just the simple statement of genuine sorrow that something had happened to her that should not have happened. She nodded. She felt the sting behind her eyes that she refused to let become anything more. She said she was fine, the way people say it when they are and also aren't. He said, quietly, that she deserved better than that. That everyone did, but that she specifically, she who was careful and thoughtful, and who had stayed when leaving would have been easier. She deserved to have things given to her gently and with full respect for what she wanted. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had been avoiding looking, the way she had been managing her own gaze around him for 2 months. He was standing a respectful distance away, this man who could have closed the space between them a dozen times in a dozen evenings and had not. This man who held the ends of leather straps when she needed extra hands, and who read folded pages into her books, and who called his sister on Sunday evenings, and who worked without complaint in 90-degree heat, and who had never once made her feel anything other than exactly as safe as she wanted to feel. She said his name again, Illy. He said yes. She said she'd been thinking about something for a while. She said she didn't usually say things she'd been thinking without being sure of them, but she was sure of this, and she thought he ought to know that she had been thinking about what it would be like if he kissed her, actually kissed her, not the way Marcus Hale had done it, not taken, but given. She said she thought there was a difference, and that she wanted to know it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the fullest silence she had ever been inside of. He closed the distance between them slowly, in the way of someone who is being deliberate, who wants the closing of distance to be a thing she can see coming and choose, and he stopped just close enough that she could have stepped away, and he would have let her, and they both knew it. He asked her if this was what she wanted, not performatively, not as a formality, but as a real question with room for a real answer. She said yes. Her voice was low but steady. He touched her face first, just the edge of his thumb against her cheek, and the gentleness of it, the absolute unhurriedness of it, made her chest ache in a way that was entirely different from ache of the afternoon's earlier intrusion. He tilted her face up slightly, his hands so careful they might have been holding something he was afraid to damage, and then he kissed her with the full and patient attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and no other priority in the world than this single moment and what it means. It was slow. It was soft. It asked nothing and it offered everything, and she felt the difference between this and what had come before, the way you feel the difference between cold and warmth, between something imposed and something given, between a door broken down and a door swung open from the inside. When they parted, she had her hands in the front of his shirt without quite knowing when they'd gotten there. He was looking at her with those dark eyes that were always thinking more than they said, and she saw in them something that had been there for a while now, something patient and serious and warm. He said quietly that that was how love was meant to feel, not triumphant, not proud, just true, the way he said most things, with the particular gravity of someone who has no interest in lying, who understands that truth is a kind of courtesy you give to people you respect. She said she thought she was beginning to understand the difference. He smiled then, that smile that changed his face, and she thought that she would like to spend a long time looking at that smile, which was not a thought she had expected to have this summer of heat and worry and her father's quiet grief and her own deferred life. She had not expected any of this when the dust came up the drive behind his truck on that Tuesday morning in late June. They sat on the porch steps when her father came home that evening, and her father looked at them and said nothing, but something in his face loosened, something that had been held tight for 3 winters. He went inside and made coffee, and after a while he came back out and handed them each a cup and sat down in the old rocking chair that had been her mother's chair, and the three of them watched the last of the daylight move across the fields together without speaking, which was its own language, its own conversation, full of things that words would only have diminished. Clara thought about the graduate program that night for the first time in weeks without the weight of guilt attached to it. She lay in her childhood bed in the dark farmhouse and thought about what it meant, that she had stayed, and what it might mean eventually to go. She thought about her father and about the farm and about Illy Cade sleeping above the tack house with whatever thoughts he slept with. And she thought that some things you defer not because you are afraid but because you are waiting, without knowing you are waiting, for something to shift the whole arrangement of your life into something that makes a different kind of sense. She thought that the arrangement was shifting. August came. She stopped deferring things, not in the large decisive way of announcements and clean breaks, but in the small daily way that real change usually happens, in the incremental willingness to reach for what she wanted, to say what she meant, to ask questions she had been saving. She called the graduate program and had a long conversation with the director, who was accommodating, who said things that surprised her with their generosity, who seemed to understand that a life is not a timetable. She told her father about the conversation at dinner, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he had always known she would go, and that the farm would manage, and that she had stayed long enough and then some, and she saw that this had cost him something to say, and she loved him more for having said it. She told Illy about it 2 evenings later on the same steps, where most of the important things between them had happened. He listened, he asked good questions. He did not ask what would happen to them, what would happen to this thing that had begun between them with folded pages, and held leather straps and an evening kiss in the dry summer air, because he was not that kind of person, the kind who reaches ahead of the moment and tries to pin down what cannot yet be pinned. She asked it for him. She said she didn't know how to talk about what came next except to say that she knew what was real, and she had never in her life let go of something real. He said he was someone who knew how to wait for things worth waiting for. He said it without sentiment, just as fact, the way he said most things. She said she knew that about him. She said it was one of the things she was most sure of. The summer moved toward its end the way Millhaven summers always did, slowly and then all at once, the heat beginning to break in the mornings before returning by noon, the light changing its angle, something in the smell of the air suggesting that the season was finishing its work. Clara began to pack in the measured way of someone who is not fleeing but departing with intention, and she helped her father arrange for additional help through the winter, and she drove into town and had a conversation with Marcus Hale's father that was brief and serious, and which she would later describe to Illy only as necessary and complete. On her last evening at the farm before she left for school, she and Illy walked the eastern fence line in the late afternoon light, the long golden light of late summer that makes everything look like a memory being made in real time, and they talked about small things and large things without distinguishing between them, the way people talk when they are comfortable with each other's company and do not need the conversation to perform any function beyond itself. At the end of the walk where the fence turned back toward the barn, he stopped and turned to her and kissed her again, his hands in her hair, her palms flat against his chest, both of them standing in the long light with the smell of the fields around them and the sound of the horses moving in the distance. And it was the same as the first time and different too, deeper, surer, the kiss of two people who know each other in the particular way that comes from careful and honest attention paid over time. She pressed her forehead against his when they parted. She said she would come back. He said he knew. She said she would write letters, actual letters, because she was the kind of person who believed that some things deserved the commitment of paper. He said he would write back, and that his penmanship was poor, but his intentions were good. And she laughed the way she hadn't laughed enough that summer, fully, without managing it. She left the next morning before the heat settled in, the truck loaded with her boxes and her books, and the particular determination of someone who has learned the difference between deferring her life and living it. Her father stood in the drive and held her for a long time, and she held him back. And when she finally let go, she saw that his eyes were bright and that he was smiling, and she understood that he was proud and that the pride was not despite her going, but because of it. Illy was at the fence doing the morning check, and he raised a hand as she drove past, and she raised one back, and in the rearview mirror she watched him watch her go, this steady man with his dark eyes and his history of waiting for things worth waiting for, this man who had shown her the difference between something taken and something given, between the first poor definition of a thing and the true thing itself. The dust came up behind her tires on the gravel drive the same way it had come up behind his, that first morning in June, and she thought about that, about how the same dust could be an arriving and a leaving, how the same road could carry things toward you and carry you away, and how the distances between people who are honest with each other are never as final as they look from the outside. She drove with the windows down and the morning coming in and her whole life waiting in the distance ahead of her, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was not haunting anything, not deferring anything, not carrying love like a stone around her neck. She was just herself, moving forward, knowing what was real and knowing where she was going and knowing, with the quiet certainty of someone who has learned to trust the evidence of careful attention that real things have a way of remaining. The road opened up before her. The fields ran along on either side, gold and wide and shimmering in the early heat. She kept driving,